Hello everyone, welcome to React Advanced tutorial. In this tutorial, we will talk about HTTP request and any kind of network call or server call that we want to make inside of our application. What we learn here, we will get familiar with Fetch API. This is a built-in JavaScript API that we can use for making HTTP requests. We will learn how to make the network call in React app, and we will see how we can use the data once we receive the response. So here's the final product that we will learn by end of this tutorial. So as you can see on the screen, this is a list of books. How do we get these books? There's a network call that we make in our application, which is called books. And if I see the response, I see basically 10 objects. And inside of each object, I have characters for each book. So it has the URL, it has a name, it has country. So it has all of the info, but on the view, we just display the name of it. So as you can see, we get the name and we show it on top. That's all we will learn in this tutorial. Get the stuff from the network tab or network call or server, and then display it on the view. Very simple. Okay, in the previous season of React development tutorial, we've learned how to create React app and how is the structure look like. So I used those instructions and I created a scaffold, a structure for our React app, and that is it. So if you have not watched those tutorials, so I would highly recommend to go back and watch it. So this is the application that we have. This is called Fetch HTTP Request, and it has the public src and package and everything else that we learned in previous season tutorial of our React application. So what we have here, it's a simple view, which is home page, and the page that we can add our view, we can add our books inside of it. So currently it is just a very simple component, functional component. And again, if you are not familiar with the functional components or React development, I would highly recommend to go back and watch the previous tutorials for previous season. And it's empty view currently, and what we want to do, we want to add the list of books inside of it. So what we need here is making the API call. So it's better to create a new file and add our logic for calling the server in a different file, because it's not a good idea to add everything in one file. So where do we add it? I prefer to add it in the src root folder that we have here. We probably can create a new folder, and since it's kind of like a utility, we can call it util. And inside of this util folder, since this is REST client API that we are going to add, we can call this REST client. And this is the TypeScript file. It's not a JSX file. It's basically TypeScript or JavaScript file. So for this purpose of tutorial, we start using TypeScript. We had the same structure for the first season. We never talked about TypeScript itself, how we can add the types. We will get to it later. But it's better to start the project with TypeScript. So I'll call it REST client, and it created the file for me. Now what do I put here? So basically I want to put the fetch API that I want to call in this home page. So first we create the fetch, and then we will call it the home page. So we can create a function and we call it the same name that we have for the file name here. We can call it REST client, and what it does, it's a function, and it returns for us, what does it return? It basically returns the fetch. And what is fetch? Fetch is the built-in API for JavaScript that will do all of the HTTP requests. So we can call this fetch and it will do everything for us. So currently it doesn't like it because we didn't finish all of the things that it needs. But for now, I'll leave it like this. And what do we do at the end of each file? If you remember from previous tutorials, we have to export it. So this file needs an export, and we can say export default is REST client, and like this. So now we have to see what do we need for fetch. There are two parameters, two arguments that this fetch API accepts. The first one is the URL. What is the URL that you want to make the request? So you can add the URL here. So since it's string, you can just send the string URL. And what is the second parameter that we have? It's basically the options that we need for fetch requests. And at the end, we can just do whatever we want with the response. But for fetch request, this is what it needs. First, it needs the URL, and then it requires some options. What are the options? The headers, the method. For example, for HTTP requests, we need some headers to set. We need to tell them if it's a GET method or POST method. So for the purpose of testing, the options that I provide here are these. I add the header, which I would like to get application JSON, and for this, I think, yeah, this one is not needed. And for the URL, in order to get the books, there is an API which is public, and you can just call this URL to fetch. I add this one in the new line so you can read better. So this URL I found it from internet, and it's basically gets all of the books. If I go to the browser and just go to this URL, it will return all of the books with all of the properties. So I can use this and call the API, and it will return. Okay, now since our REST client API is ready to make, we can use it in our view. So we have to make this call or call this function from somewhere, and the best place to make it call in the home page. That's the place that we want to show up our books. So where do we call this? Basically, we want to call it when the view gets load or component did mount. And what is the function that do the component did mount, and when does it get called when the components mount? Is the React hooks that we learned in previous season, and it's called useEffect. So I will import it. So the way that we import it is very easy. We can just say useEffect, and then we can just define it right here, and it accepts a function, and inside of this function we can add our stuff. And if we add an empty array, it will call only once when the view will get load. So we can call our REST client API here. If you have not watched the useEffect or React hooks, I would definitely recommend to go back and watch the previous season. But we can call our API here, REST client. Again, WebStorm is smart to know that it has to import the REST client that we just created here. So if you have to do it manually, make sure that the path is correct. It is in the util folder and REST client file. So now we can just basically see in the view how does it make it call. Let me see what it's complaining. It says okay, so it says the return value is ignored. Yeah, I know that we are not using the return value, but I just want to see in the network tab that we are making this REST client API. Let's go back and refresh the view. Okay, in debug tutorial that we had in first season, we learned how to go to the network tab of the browser and see the network calls. So if I refresh the page, as you can see, this is the books call that we are making, and the response will come back here. So the code that we added is basically working. Now we have to use it somehow. We have to get the data and show it on the view. So the next step is to go back to REST client, and we should tell this fetch, okay, so there are two cases that will happen. First, if the API is successful, what do we do when it's successful? So since it's returning a promise, if you are not familiar with promise, I will add some JavaScript tutorials later that I will teach you what is promise, but basically you don't need to know that promise completely. Basically you should know that fetch returns something that says, okay, wait for some time until I'm done, and then whenever I'm done, do something like this. Do whatever I put inside of this .then statement. So it's basically waits until we get the result, and then it will execute this line of code. And we can just add some function here like handle fetch success. So we can define this function right below. So it's complaining because we have not defined it yet. We can just simply define it here and say, okay, so this is the function that we want to be executed whenever the API is done. So this function, when it gets called, it will return us an argument, which is basically the result of the API call. So basically this content is inside of this result. So we need to define this argument here. And what is the return value? We need to return result. So whenever the response is successful, result dot, and the format is JSON. So we need to return the JSON format when it is successful. And that's then when it's successful. What if it's not successful? What do we do when it's not successful? It goes to a catch statement, and we can do the same thing like we did for success case. We define a function that whenever it's not successful, it goes to that function, and we can define that function right here. For this tutorial, we don't do a lot with that error, but in a real application, we probably try to make the call again. But for us, I'll just do console log. So I say a console log, and we just return the error. So basically we log the error, whatever it shows the error is, and then it returns the error if we want it. So that is all we need for the REST client. So I'll go through it one more time. We make the call, and then basically this then means the same thing in English. After the call is done, it will make this function call, and it will go through this function, and it says, oh, okay, so I have to return the result with the JSON format. But if it fails, it will execute this line, which is this function, and this function just logs the error. That's all we need for REST client. So we can save it and go back to the component. We don't see any changes, but for the home page, we need to change something. We have to use the return value of this REST client API. How do we use it? This one is also, we can use then as well. So basically it means that whenever this part is done, then do this. And that's why you see that it's no longer complaining. It doesn't add underline on it because I'm using the value .then. So what do we do here? Basically, we have to define a function, and this then also return the result. Basically, whatever result that we are sending here, we can receive it here like this. So we need to store this result into some object so we can use it inside of this view. So how do we do that? It's very simple. we can just define a const variable here. The same way that we learned in first season, we can use setter and React hooks, and we can just call it books and set books. This is basically a state that we are using, and it used the use state React hooks to set the stuff for us, and you have to import it as well, so make sure that you import it. And so this will be our books which we want to show it on the view later, but we need to set these books. When do we set it? When we receive the response, we set the books. So we can just say set books, which is this React hooks, and then we can pass the result. So whatever we get from the response, we set it for the books. So now what do we need for the books? How do we show it on the view? It's very simple. Again, we learned it in first season. How do we show multiple items inside of an array? We are using map, and we can say map, and this map is also having a function inside of it, so we can just say map. And basically, since we want an unordered list around our items, so we can just put this ul above around this function, and so we can just add li for each book. And in order to add the code, we can just say this map returns the book, and if you remember, inside of each item here there's a book, and each item has a property, and we want to read this name. So inside of each item there is a name property, so we want to access that. So this book, we can just say book dot name, and yeah, basically that's it. And we know that it will complain about the key here. I will add it later, but let's execute it and see what is this error for. Okay, so it's complaining because it says we need to define a type. Okay, one last thing that we missed is if I hover over here, it says that it's not a return statement. We have to return this, and it should be inside of the parentheses, and we should give this one a type and save it. So this is the long version of it. We can use ES6 and remove the curly brace. I will talk about it later. But if I save it and go back to the view, now everything is showing up on our view. So yeah, that's all for fetch, and we can simplify our code, but as I said, we can use the shorter version of the ES6 and say put everything in one line, and as you can see, it should be it. I think I can remove this one, and still it should work. If I refresh the page, yes, it works. I can do the same thing here. As you can see, it doesn't require this curly brace. I can just simply remove this curly brace and have everything in one line. Same here. And we can do the same thing for REST client. This one is returning something. We can use the shorter version of ES6 and just have everything in one line. It's very cleaner, simple, and that's it. Also, in order to make our API more generic, so next time we want to make this REST client, for example, if it's a different URL or different parameters that we want to pass, it's better to have these as an argument. So we can say this one, first one is URL, and the second one is option. And since the URL type, we have not talked about type, but we know that it's type string, and the other one could be a type any. So instead of hard coding the URL here, we can just pass it from the place that we are calling this function and just call this URL. And if I go back to home page, I can just add the first parameter here and the second parameter, which is the options that we have here. We can copy paste the options here and options and add it back here. I added 2 curly braces and the dot then in the next line. So this is still should work. We just move this to make our API more generic. And I think, oh, this is options. Okay, so now it should work. If I refresh the page, it's still working with our changes. That's all for the Fetch API and how we can make an HTTP request.